Have you ever felt like the more deeply you think, the more alone you feel? It's not just in your head. And you're not the only one who's felt that quiet gap open between you and the world. It doesn't start with conflict. It starts with distance. You say something honest, something thoughtful, and the room shifts. Not because you were wrong, but because your depth pulled the moment too far from the surface. Carl Jung believed that the journey of becoming yourself, what he called individuation, is not about fitting in. It's about integration, about becoming whole, about meeting every part of yourself, including the ones others never face. And that process sets you apart. You begin to think differently, you feel more, you carry more awareness than most people want to hold, and that creates separation. Not because you chose to leave, but because the path you're on doesn't have many followers. But why does becoming more of yourself make you feel more alone? Jung understood that most people live on the surface. They don't want to face their shadow. They don't want to meet what's unconscious. They just want to play their role and stay in rhythm with the group. But individuation breaks rhythm. It slows things down. It opens a depth most people would rather avoid. And once you've seen that depth, you can't go back. Which raises a deeper question. If you keep going inward, how far are you willing to go without being understood? You've probably felt it. A moment when you brought something real into a conversation, something that mattered, and instead of leaning in, the room pulled away. Not with judgment, just with silence. It wasn't what you said, it was how far down it reached. Most people don't want to go there, not because they're bad, but because depth requires discomfort. Carl Jung believed that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own soul. They'll stay busy, they'll stay distracted, they'll live inside roles and routines that keep the unconscious buried. Because once you start digging, you can't control what comes up. The intelligent person often sees beneath the surface. They notice patterns others ignore. They feel the tension between what's said and what's actually meant. And that can make people uncomfortable, not because you're difficult, but because your presence invites reflection. And reflection is hard when someone's spent their life avoiding it. But what happens when your mind keeps going where others stop? You don't mean to challenge people. You're just not content staying on the surface. You don't want to pretend. You don't want to repeat, you want to understand. But the moment you bring that energy into a space that wasn't built for it, the atmosphere shifts, and slowly you start to see the pattern. Not everyone wants to see what you see. Not everyone wants to feel what you feel. And that leads to a deeper truth. If depth creates distance, what does it mean to keep thinking deeply in a world that stays at the surface? You didn't choose to be on the outside. It just started happening. You spoke honestly. You asked different questions. You saw things others didn't want to name. And slowly, the group stepped back. No arguments. No confrontation. Just less eye contact. Fewer invitations. A feeling that you were somewhere nearby, but not really with them. Jung often spoke of the outsider, the one who leaves the safety of the collective to seek something deeper, not out of pride, not to feel superior, but because they are pulled toward something more real. The deeper you go, the fewer people follow. And at some point, you look around and realize no one else is standing in the same place. It can be confusing. You didn't ask to separate. You didn't mean to break rhythm. You were just being true to what you saw. But truth has a weight, and not everyone wants to carry it. So what do you do when the world no longer recognizes you? Jung believed that going inward often means letting go of outward approval, that the one who seeks truth must be willing to lose comfort, belonging, even language that once made sense. You're not just thinking differently, you're living in a different layer of experience, and that changes how people respond to you, even if they don't know why. You've crossed into new terrain, and that raises a quiet question. If your journey takes you this far from the group, what does it take to keep going? Most people don't want to change. Not because they are unwilling to grow, but because change feels like loss. Loss of identity, loss of certainty, loss of belonging. Jung believed that transformation begins when the unconscious is brought into awareness. But awareness doesn't just illuminate, it disrupts. It dissolves what used to hold everything in place. And society doesn't welcome that kind of disruption. You've likely seen it. You bring a new perspective into a conversation, and people pull back. Not because they think you're wrong, but because your presence makes them question something they'd rather leave alone. You don't argue. You don't preach. You just name what's there, and the air gets heavier. People say they want insight. What they usually want is reassurance. They want their worldview affirmed, their beliefs reflected, their identity protected. But transformation doesn't protect. It confronts. And that confrontation is often mistaken for threat. You didn't show up to tear things down. So why does it feel like your clarity makes people defensive? Jung understood this tension. He believed that people naturally resist anything that threatens the image they've built of themselves, that the ego will fight to survive, even if it means rejecting what could set it free. And if you carry that kind of clarity, you might find yourself quietly rejected too. Not because you were harsh, but because you didn't pretend. And that leads to something deeper. If society resists the truth you carry, where are you supposed to bring it? There are things you've had to face that most people never will. Not because you wanted to, but because your mind wouldn't let you look away. Carl Jung called it the shadow. The part of the self that holds what we hide, deny, or refuse to acknowledge. And to become whole, you have to face it. You've done that work. You've seen your own darkness. You've learned that being self-aware isn't always peaceful. It's often painful. But once you've done it, you can't unsee it. You notice it in others too. The patterns they won't admit. The fears they dress up as confidence. The tension just beneath their words. You don't bring it up to hurt anyone. You're just aware of what they're trying to bury. And that awareness alone can create distance. Not because you say too much, but because you see too clearly. Can you still connect with people who refuse to look inward? Jung believed that most people would rather live in the illusion of being fine than face the work of becoming whole. They reject the mirror, not because of what it shows them, but because it asks them to change. And when you become that mirror, you often find yourself pushed away. Not because you're cruel, but because your presence carries weight. You've made the darkness conscious. And in doing so, you've stepped into a kind of solitude most people never reach. And now comes the question. If you've seen more than others are willing to face, how do you keep your heart open? You think clearly. You speak with care. You offer your thoughts not to impress, but to connect. But something doesn't land. People hear your words, but not the meaning behind them. They nod, but don't stay with you. They listen, but not for long. And slowly, you begin to feel it. The more clearly you speak, the less you feel understood. Jung believed that intelligence doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it makes connection harder. Not because you're closed off, but because the way you process the world doesn't match the way most people experience it. You carry contradiction. You hold complexity. You see layers in things others only glance at. And while that depth is a gift, it can also make you feel unseen. You explain something that matters to you, something real. And the room responds like you asked too much of it. How do you stay honest without becoming distant? Jung believed that the inner world, when fully opened, doesn't always find a place in the outer one. The more you know yourself, the more you may feel unknown by others. You're not trying to disconnect. You're trying to stay real. But reality isn't always welcome in every room. So you learn to speak less, to carry more than you share, to protect the weight of your thoughts by holding them in silence. And that leaves you with a question. If connection doesn't come easily, how do you keep going without turning cold? You didn't ask to see this much. It just happened. One realization at a time. One layer deeper than the last. And now you walk through the world carrying things most people never notice. Contradictions that live in plain sight. Truths no one talks about. Tensions hiding in everyday conversations. You don't feel better because you see it. You just feel heavier. Carl Jung didn't glorify awareness. He knew that deep insight doesn't bring ease. It brings responsibility. Once you've made something conscious, you can't return it to sleep. You can't pretend. You can't unsee. You carry what others can't. Not because you want to, but because you're wired that way. And sometimes it makes you feel more observer than participant, more witness than companion. You move through spaces others enjoy, and something feels off. Not because of the people, but because of the illusion they still live inside. If awareness isolates you, is it still worth it? Jung believed it was, but he also acknowledged the pain. He understood that to see clearly is to lose the comfort of not knowing. To speak honestly is to lose the ease of being easily liked. This is the cost. You don't belong as easily. You don't connect as quickly, but you live more truthfully. And that opens another question. If you no longer belong to the world as it is, where do you go to become who you're meant to be? There comes a moment when you stop trying to be understood. Not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because you've realized the conversation you need most isn't out there. It's in here. Carl Jung believed that when the outer world no longer reflects who you are, the path turns inward. Not as a retreat, but as a return. To the self you've been slowly uncovering beneath all the noise. You stop seeking approval. You stop asking people to meet you at your depth. And you begin to ask different questions. What do I truly believe? What am I here to become? What have I been carrying that's not even mine? This is the beginning of inner work. Not the kind that chases perfection, but the kind that seeks wholeness. You stop polishing the mask. You start listening to what's behind it. And what you find isn't always beautiful, but it's real. And that reality is what you've been missing. But if you build your life inward, how do you stay open to the world outside? Jung believed the goal was not to escape the world, but to face it with a self that's no longer fractured. You're not abandoning others, you're reclaiming yourself. piece by piece, truth by truth. And in that process, you begin to understand something else. If the world couldn't hold all of you, can you become the one who finally does? There are days when your depth feels like weight, when your thoughts are too heavy for small talk, when your truth feels too complex to share. And even when you try to explain it, the words don't quite reach the feeling. You say something real, and the silence that follows says more than anyone will. It's hard to carry that kind of awareness. Hard to hold what others turn away from. Hard to live in a world where being thoughtful makes things harder, not easier. Jung understood that clearly. He believed that depth was both a wound and a source of wisdom, that those who go inward will suffer more, but also understand more. You didn't ask for this kind of mind. You didn't choose to see things differently. But here you are, and some days it hurts. Not because your thoughts are wrong, but because there's no simple place to put them. You feel the burden of knowing, but also the quiet strength of having stayed true to it. If you weren't meant to fit in, what were you meant to become? Jung believed that wholeness is not about comfort. It's about integration. It's about becoming fully who you are, even if it means being misunderstood. The same thoughts that isolate you are also the ones that guide you. The same awareness that brings sorrow also brings truth. And truth, even when it hurts, still matters. But this raises one final question. If the world never sees the full value of what you carry, does it still leave something behind? You may never be fully understood. Not by your friends, not by your family, maybe not even by the people who care about you most. But that doesn't make your thoughts any less real. It doesn't make your awareness any less valid. And it doesn't make your presence any less needed. Jung believed that the more you become yourself, the less you resemble what the world expects. And that's not a flaw. It's a sign you're on the path. You carry insights others avoid. You ask questions most people never consider. You see the world not as it's presented, but as it really is. And yes, that distance can be painful, but it also means you're awake. You aren't chasing applause. You aren't trying to belong at the cost of yourself. You're living from the inside out. That may separate you, but it also frees you. You are not broken for thinking deeply. You are just further along than most people are ready to go. Jung believed that the soul's path was not about popularity. It was about wholeness, about truth, about becoming so fully yourself that nothing needs to be added or removed. And once you become that, once you stop waiting to be understood, something quiet begins to grow. Not loneliness, but peace. Not applause, but purpose. And while the world may not recognize the full depth of what you carry, the truth is still there. You see what you see. You know what you know. And that, in the end, still matters.